The table was suspended in midair, adorned with the finest china, cutlery flawlessly polished, and a variety of foods that smelled just as opulent as they looked. To an outsider, this would have appeared to be a pleasant family gathering, with wine glasses clinking, laughter, and polite conversation. But I knew better. I had spent years walking into this house, understanding that beneath the surface, something was always brewing. Emily, my wife, walked a little ahead, tension building like a storm ready to explode. With her hand on my arm, she whispered, "Let's just get through tonight." I nodded and smiled just a little, but I knew exactly what was going to happen. It always did. At the head of the table sat Henry, my father-in-law. Despite his wide smile and charming demeanor, he had a long history of financial disasters, each leaving him in ruins, and yet he always found someone else to blame when things went wrong. He never took responsibility. He just kept pointing fingers. And tonight, his target was me. Dinner began politely enough. The conversation drifted through family gossip, business updates, and light-hearted chatter, but I wasn't naive. I noticed how Henry kept glancing at me, his mouth set in a tight line. He was waiting for his moment, and then it arrived. He stood, tapping his fingers furiously against his wine glass. The sound of his chair scraping against the floor cut through the noise, and the room fell silent. He cleared his throat, adjusting his suit like a politician about to deliver a grand speech. I had seen this performance far too many times. "Family," he began, his deep voice carrying a weight of importance. "There's something that needs to be said tonight." He paused, his eyes locking onto mine. I braced myself. Henry spread his arms dramatically. "We are a family that supports one another, aren't we?" Murmurs rippled through the room. Some nodded, others simply watched. Emily sat next to him, perfectly still, her hands neatly folded in her lap, but in her gaze I saw hesitation. She knew exactly where this was headed. Henry turned to me. "Daniel," he said, his tone dripping with forced camaraderie, "you've done well for yourself. We're all so proud of you." The words rolled off his tongue, but his voice held something that wasn't quite admiration. I didn't respond. I knew there was more. He dragged out the moment, carefully crafting his next statement. But what kind of man succeeds and then forgets those who helped him get there? There it was, the accusation, the setup. Henry was making his move, and I could feel the energy in the room shift. People tense in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. I stayed silent, my expression unreadable. Emily stirred beside him, lips parting as if she wanted to speak, but Henry had already set the stage. "I've always believed family looks out for one another," he continued. "When someone is struggling, we don't turn our backs." His voice grew louder, conviction rising as he played to his audience. And then the final blow. "Knowing all the hardships I've endured, after everything I've done for you and Emily, you refuse to help me?" Gasps, murmurs. Eyes darted to me, waiting for my reaction. Emily finally spoke. "Dad, maybe—" Henry ignored her. He turned back to me, lowering his voice. "Tell me, Daniel," he whispered, "do you really think you did it all on your own?" I didn't flinch, didn't blink. I simply met his gaze, feeling the weight of his arrogance pressing down on me. This wasn't new. For years, he had hinted at this, his delusional belief that he was somehow responsible for my success, that I owed him something. But I had worked for everything I had, brick by brick. No shortcuts, no handouts. So I leaned back in my chair and said calmly, "I don't remember ever asking you for anything, Henry." A whisper rippled through the room. Henry's face darkened. He hadn't expected me to confront him so directly. Emily's voice was soft. "Daniel, please, family is important." I turned to my wife, the woman I had built a life with, but at that moment, I saw something I'd been ignoring for years. Unquestioning loyalty, blind devotion, and then the words that changed everything. "You owe us for your success." Silence. A dagger of betrayal hung heavy in the air. I clenched my fists under the table, staring at them both. This wasn't about money. This was about control. Henry, seeing my silence, mistook it for submission. But what they didn't realize was that I had come prepared. When this evening ended, I would leave them all in stunned silence, because I knew the truth, and the truth would shatter them. He lurched forward, scraping his chair, and his voice exploded with ungratefulness. His hands erupted in wrath, distorting his face as he slammed loudly into the floor. But before he could get to me, a hand shot out. Matt, Emily's cousin, a former college football player. In mid-stride, he grabbed. Henry's grip was solid as he pushed the man back into a seat, his voice sharp, his chest heaving. But despite his fury, he couldn't get past Matt. The room was in chaos. Gasps filled the air, voices overlapping in a growing wave of tension. Emily was on her feet, eyes wide with shock. Henry stopped, looking around as realization dawned. For the first time in his life, the entire room had turned against him. His carefully constructed manipulation had failed. He had been outplayed. I stood, rolling up my sleeves, my voice calm despite the confusion. You wanted a public altercation. Henry. My gaze swept across the family, their faces reflecting a range of emotions: shock, disbelief, anger. I turned and left, wondering if the truth was worth the damage it had caused. But it was too late to take it back. Henry would never recover from this. As I stepped away, I caught sight of him struggling in his chair, his face twisted with rage. But he had stopped shouting. He knew that the materials I had exposed had shattered the story he had so carefully built. The room fell into a stunned silence. Their eyes darted between Henry and me, like spectators at a match they hadn't realized they were watching. Some looked appalled, others betrayed. But what stood out most was a complete and utter lack of support for Henry now that his deception was laid bare. Emily sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if she needed something solid to hold on to. I placed the documents before her and saw something flicker in her expression. More than anger, more than confusion. It was doubt, uncertainty. Did you know about this? I asked, my voice steady. Her lips parted, but when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Her breathing was uneven. She was in shock. But as I studied her face, I knew she was telling the truth. This was new to her. Henry had always been careful. He didn't leave a paper trail. His lies thrived on manipulation, on making himself the victim, on twisting emotions to suit his needs. But now, the whispers in the room grew louder. The weight of his deception was sinking in. Linda, Emily's aunt, suddenly rose from her chair. She pressed her lips together, shaking her head before letting out a bitter laugh. Henry's voice carried across the room in a desperate attempt at control. He tried to explain, to shift blame, to redefine the narrative. But then, for the first time, I saw it, real fear in his eyes. Linda inhaled sharply, her fists clenched. Since we're telling the truth tonight, Henry, let me ask you something. When exactly do you plan to pay me back the $50,000 you stole? Gasps rippled through the family. Henry's head snapped toward her, his mouth opening, but Linda didn't give him the chance. I'm not sure what you're talking about, he stammered. Linda slammed her hands on the table. Oh, don't be ridiculous. 8 years ago, you came to me with some incredible business opportunity. You swore I'd get double my money in 6 months. But what really happened, Henry? His face turned red, but he said nothing. You disappeared, she spat. You ignored my calls, my messages. And when I finally got a hold of you, you gave me some excuse about the market crashing. Then, she let out a sharp laugh, you had the nerve to ask for more money. A hush fell over the room as people exchanged uneasy glances. Emily's fingers trembled as she looked between her father and her aunt. Then, another voice broke the silence. Wait, Emily's cousin David said, standing slowly. Henry, didn't you ask me for money last year? Henry stiffened. David, please. Sit down. His voice was eerily calm. But David wasn't backing down. You told me you had emergency medical bills. You said you needed $20,000. That was a lie, wasn't it? His eyes burned with realization. And suddenly, the floodgates opened. He told me he needed money for a legal case. 2 years ago, he said it was for his car. One by one, the family spoke up, each voice adding to the growing storm. Henry had been bleeding them all dry, manipulating them, one after another. This is insane. Henry shouted, his hands shaking. "You're all turning against me." Linda scoffed. "And yet, you were the one lecturing everyone about owing the family." Emily's face was pale, her grip still locked on the table as she processed the truth. She no longer saw her father as a flawed man who made mistakes. She saw him for what he was, a thief, a liar. Then Linda's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "You always thought you could manipulate us. But let's talk about what you did to my sister. To your own wife." Emily inhaled sharply. "You drained her finances," Linda said, her voice tight with anger. "You crushed her spirit. And when she was at her lowest, you abandoned her." Murmurs swept through the room. Linda turned to Emily, her expression softer but no less intense. "Did you ever wonder why your mother was always so worried?